Why war? Why can't nations get along? Why can't people from different countries relate to one another, if not in a respectable manner, at least in an acceptable one? And how can people avoid the violence that lead to and perpetuate slaughters on the battlefield? Now, these are the kind of things Erich Fromm pondered upon as he witnessed World War I tore down his homeland when he was young. He goes on to develop a theory of personality that looks at people from the perspective of psychology, history, and anthropology. Erich Fromm's basic thesis is that modern-day people have been torn away from their prehistoric union with nature and also from one another, yet have the power of reasoning, foresight, and imagination. This combination of lack of animal instincts and presence of rational thought makes humans the freaks of the universe. Self-awareness, if you think about it, contributes to feelings of loneliness, isolation, and homelessness. To escape from these feelings, people strive to become reunited with nature and with their fellow human beings. Now, trained in Freudian psychoanalysis and influenced by Karl Marx, Karen Horney, and other socially oriented theorists, Fromm developed a theory of personality that emphasizes the influence of sociobiological factors, history, economics, and class structure. His humanistic psychoanalysis assumed that humanity's separation from the natural world has produced feelings of loneliness and isolation, a condition he called basic anxiety. Fromm was more than a personality theorist. He was a social critic, a psychotherapist, a philosopher, a biblical scholar, a cultural anthropologist, a psychobiographer. His humanistic psychoanalysis looks at people from a historical and cultural perspective rather than a strictly psychological one. It is less concerned with the individual and more concerned with those characteristics common to a culture. So, in this video, we are going to talk about Fromm's biography, his theory, and his concept of humanity. So, Fromm was born on March 23, 1900 in Frankfurt, Germany, the one child of middle-class Orthodox Jewish parents. His father, Naphtali Fromm, was the son of a rabbi and the grandson of two rabbis. His mother, Rosa Cross Fromm, was the niece of Ludwig Cross, a well-known Talmudic scholar. Like Hume, Erich came from a very religious family, in his case, Orthodox Jews. Fromm himself later became what he called an atheistic mystic. Now, Fromm's early childhood was less than ideal. He recalled that he had a very neurotic set of parents and that he was probably a rather unbearably neurotic child too. His father, according to Erich, was rather moody. His mother, frequently depressed. In other words, like quite a few of the people we've looked at in the past lessons, his childhood was not very happy. Now, in his autobiography, Beyond the Chains of Illusion, Fromm talks about two events in his early adolescence that started him along his path. The first involved a friend of the family's. In the book, he said, maybe she was 25 years of age. She was beautiful, attractive, and in addition, a painter. The first painter I ever known. I remember having heard that she had been engaged, but after some time had broken the engagement. I remember that she was almost invariably in the company of her widowed father. As I remember him, he was old, uninteresting, and rather unattractive man. Or so I thought. Maybe my judgment was somewhat biased by jealousy. Then one day, I heard the shocking news. Her father had died, and immediately afterwards, she killed herself and left a will which stipulated that she wanted to be buried with her father. As you can imagine, this news hit the 12-year-old Eric hard and found himself asking what many of us might ask. Why? How could this young woman make such a decision? Now, later, he began finding some answers, at least partially ones, admittedly in Freud. Now, the second event was even larger. That is World War One. Fromm was 14 when World War One began. Actually, too young to fight, but not too young to be impressed or to be impressed by the irrationality of the German nationalism that he had observed firsthand. He saw the extremes that nationalism could go to. All around him, he heard the message, we Germans are more, or more precisely, Christian Germans are great. They, the English and their allies, are cheap mercenaries. The hatred, the war hysteria frightened him as well as it should. So again, he wanted to understand something irrational, the irrationality of mass behavior. And he found some answers, this time in the writings of Karl Marx. So, he went on to study sociology at the University of Heidelberg, earning his doctorate in 1922 under the supervision of Albert Weber. And in 1924, he began studying psychoanalysis at the University of Frankfurt before moving to the Berlin Institute of Psychoanalysis. So, in 1926, he married Frieda Reichmann, a woman 10 years his senior who had once been Fromm's own psychoanalysis. Now, the marriage dissolved just after 4 years. So, throughout his life, Fromm maintained a busy career that included numerous teaching positions in addition to publishing a number of books and running his own clinical practice. Fromm helped found the Frankfurt Psychoanalytic Institute, where he lectured from 1929 to 1932. Now, after the Nazi rose to power, the institute was moved to Geneva, Switzerland, and later to Columbia University in New York. Now, he moved to the United States in 1934, which is a popular time for living Germany, if you ask me, and settled in New York, where he met many of other great refugee thinkers that gathered there, including Karen Horney, whom he had an affair with. Towards the end of his career, he moved to Mexico to teach. He had done considerable research into the relationship between economic class and personality types there, and he died in 1980 in Switzerland. So, as his biography suggests, Fromm's theory is rather a unique blend of Freud and Marx. Freud, of course, emphasized the unconscious biological drives, repression, and so on. In other words, Freud postulated that our characters were determined by biology. Marx, on the other hand, saw people as determined by their society and most especially by their economic system. Now, Fromm's most basic assumption is that individual personality can be understood only in the light of human history. He said that discussions of the human situation must precede that of personality, and psychology must be based on anthropological philosophical concept of human existence. Fromm believed that humans, unlike other animals, have been torn away from their prehistoric union with nature. They have no powerful instincts to adapt to a changing world. Instead, they have acquired the faculty of reason, a condition Fromm called the human dilemma. People experience this basic dilemma because they have become separate from nature and yet have the capacity to be aware of themselves as isolated beings. The human ability to reason, therefore, is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it permits people to survive, but on the other, it forces them to attempt to solve basic insoluble dichotomies. Fromm referred to these as existential dichotomies because they are rooted in people's very existence. Humans cannot do away with these existential dichotomies. They can only react to these dichotomies relative to their culture and their individual personalities. The first and most fundamental dichotomy is between life and death. Self-awareness and reason tell us that eventually we will all die. But we try to negate this dichotomy by postulating life after death, an attempt that does not alter the fact that our lives will end with death. A second existential dichotomy is that humans are capable of conceptualizing the goal of complete self-realization, but we are also aware that life is too short to reach that goal. Only if the lifespan of the individual were identical with that of mankind could he participate in the human development, which occurs in the historical process. So some people try to solve this dichotomy by assuming that their own historical period is the crowning achievement of humanity, the golden age, like what the Marcos apologists would claim. So while others postulate a continuation of development after death, the third existential dichotomy is that people are ultimately alone. Yet we cannot tolerate isolation. They are aware of themselves as separate individuals, and at the same time, they believe that their happiness depends on uniting with their fellow human beings. Although people cannot completely solve the problem of aloneness versus union, they must make an attempt or run the risk of insanity. So, which leads us to the burden of freedom. Now, the central thesis of Fromm's writing is that humans have been torn from nature. Yet, they remain part of the natural world, subject to the same physical limitations as other animals. As the only animal possessing self-awareness, imagination, and reason, humans are the freaks of the universe, as Fromm would claim. Reason is both a curse and a blessing. It is responsible for feelings of isolation and loneliness, but it's also the process that enables humans to become reunited with the world. He added to this mix, to the mix of Freudian and Marxism, two deterministic systems, something quite foreign to both Freud and Karl Marx, the idea of freedom. He allows people to transcend the determinism that Freud and Marx attributed to them. In fact, Fromm makes freedom the central characteristics of human nature. There are, Fromm points out, examples where determinism alone operates. A good example of nearly pure biological determinism a la Freud is animals. At least simple ones. Animals don't worry about freedom. Their instincts take care of everything. Toy poodle puppies, for example, don't need career counseling to decide what they are going to be when they grow up. They are going to be toy poodles. A good example of socio-economic determinism a la Karl Marx is the traditional society of Middle Ages. Just like toy poodle puppies, few people in the Middle Ages need career counseling. They had fate, the great chain of being, to tell them what to do. Basically, if your father was a peasant, you'd be a peasant. If your father was a king, that's what you'd become. And if you were a woman, well, there's only one role for women those days. Today, we might look at life in the Middle Ages or life as an animal and cringe. But the fact that the lack of freedom represented by biological and social determinism is easy. Your life is structured, meaning there's no doubt, no cause for soul searching. You will fit and you will never suffer an identity crisis. Right? So, historically speaking, this simple, if hard, life began to get shaken up with the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, people started to see humanity as the center of the universe instead of God. In other words, we didn't just look at the church and other traditional establishments for paths we were to take. Then came the Reformation, which introduced the idea of each of us being individually responsible for our own soul salvation. So, and then came democratic revolutions, such as the American and the French revolutions. Now, all of a sudden, we were supposed to govern ourselves. And then came the Industrial Revolution. And instead of tilling the soil or making things with our bare hands, we had to sell our labor in exchange for money. All of a sudden, we became employees and consumers. Then came socialist revolutions such as the Russian and the Chinese and the Vietnamese revolutions, which introduced the idea of participatory economics. You are no longer responsible for your own well-being, but for fellow workers as well. So over a mere 500 years, the idea of the individual with individual thoughts, feelings, moral conscience, freedom, and responsibility came into being, but with individuality came isolation, alienation, and bewilderment. Freedom is a difficult thing to have, and when we can, we tend to flee from it. And speaking of which, Fromm described three ways in order for us to escape freedom. The first is authoritarianism. We seek to avoid freedom by fusing ourselves with others. By becoming a part of an authoritarian system, like the Society of the Middle Ages. There are two ways to approach this. One is to submit to the power of others, becoming passive and compliant. The other is to become an authority yourself, a person who applies structure to others. Either way, you escape your separate identity. So Fromm referred to these extreme versions of authoritarianism as masochism and sadism, and points out that both feel compelled to play their separate roles, so that even the sadist, with all his apparent power over the masochist, is not free to choose his actions. But milder versions of authoritarianism is everywhere or are everywhere. In many classes, for example, there is an implicit contract between students and professors. Students demand structure, and the professors stick to his notes. It seems innocuous and even natural, but this way, the student avoids taking any responsibility for their learning, and the professor can avoid taking on the real issues of his field. The second is through destructiveness. Authoritarians respond to a painful existence by, in a sense, eliminating themselves. If there are no me, how can anything hurt me? But others respond to pain by striking out against the world. If I destroy the world, how can it hurt me? It is this escape from freedom that account for much of the indiscriminate nastiness of life, brutality, vandalism, humiliation, crime, and terrorism. Fromm adds that if a person's desire to destroy is blocked by circumstances, he or she may redirect inwards. The most obvious kind of self-destructiveness is, of course, suicide. But we can also include many illnesses, drug addiction, alcoholism, even the joys of passive entertainment like binge-watching Netflix can be associated with this. He turns Freud's death instinct upside down. Self-destructiveness is frustrated destructiveness, not the other way around. The third is automaton conformity. Authoritarians escape by hiding within an authoritarian hierarchy, but our society emphasizes equality. There is less hierarchy to hide in, though plenty remains for anyone who wants it and some who don't. When we need to hide, we hide in our mass culture instead. When I get dressed in the morning, there are so many decisions, but I only need to look at what you are wearing, scroll through social media, and my frustrations disappear. Or I can look at television, again, social media, in which, like a horoscope, will tell me quickly and effectively what to do. If I look like, talk like, think like, and feel like everyone else in my society, then I disappear into the crowd, and I don't need to acknowledge my freedom or take responsibility. It's the horizontal counterpart of authoritarianism. Now, the person who uses automaton conformity is like a social chameleon. He takes on the coloring of his surroundings. Since he looks like a million other people, he no longer feels alone. He isn't alone, perhaps, but he's not himself either. The automaton conformist experience a split between feelings or genuine feelings and the color he shows the world, very much along the lines of Horney's theory. In fact, since humanity's true nature is freedom, any of these escapes from freedom alienates us from ourselves. And it's also important to note that not all forms of freedom are bad for Erich Fromm. The emergence of political and economic freedom does not lead inevitably to the bondage of isolation and powerlessness. A person can be free and not alone, critical, yet not fulfilled with doubts, independent, and yet an integral part of mankind. People can attain this kind of freedom called positive freedom by a spontaneous and full expression of both their rational and their emotional potentialities. Now, which of these escapes from freedom you tend to use has a great deal to do with what kind of family you grew up in. Fromm outlines two kinds of unproductive families. The first is symbiotic families, and the second is withdrawing families. Now, symbiosis is the relationship between two organisms who cannot live without each other, much like that of Eddie Brock and Venom. So, in a symbiotic family, some members of the family are swallowed up by other members so that they do not fully develop personalities of their own. The most obvious example is the case where the parent swallows the child so that the child's personality is merely a reflection of the parent's wishes. In many traditional societies, this is the case with many children, especially that of girls. The other example is the case where the child swallows the parents. In this case, the child dominates or manipulates the parents who exist essentially to serve the child. Think of spoiled children. If this sounds odd to you, let me assure you that it's actually common, especially in traditional societies. And as I said, parents who spoil their children, especially in the relationship between a boy and his mother. Within the context of the particular culture, it's even necessary. How else does a boy learn the art of authority if he will need to survive as an adult? Now, in reality, nearly everyone in a traditional society leads, or rather learns, both how to dominate and how to be dominated, since nearly everyone has someone above them and below them in the social hierarchy. Obviously, the authoritarian escape from freedom is built into to such a society. But note, for all it may offend our modern standards of equality, this is the way people lived for thousands of years. It's a very stable social system. It allows for a great deal of love and friendship, and billions of people live in it still. The second is that of withdrawing families. Now, the main alternative to symbiotic families is most notable for its cool indifference, if not cold hatefulness. Although withdrawal as a family style has always been around, it has only come to dominate some societies only in the last few hundreds of years. That is, since the bourgeoisie, the merchant class, arrived on the scene in force. Now, the cold version is the older of the two, found in Northern Europe and some parts of Asia, wherever merchants are a formidable class. Parents are very demanding of their children, who are expected to live up to high, well-defined standards. Punishment is not a matter of a slap upside the head in full anger and in the middle of a dinner. It is instead a formal affair, a full-fledged ritual, possibly involving asking kids to lie down and prepare a stick, or a meeting in the woodshed. Punishment is cold-blooded and is actually done for your own good. Alternatively, a culture may use guilt and withdrawal of affection as punishment. Either way, children in these cultures become rather strongly driven to succeed with whatever their culture defines as success. Now, this puritanical style of family encourages the destructive escape from freedom, which is internalized until circumstances such as war allows its release. I might add that this kind of family more immediately encourages perfectionism, living by the rules, which is also a way of avoiding freedom that Fromm does not actually discuss. When the rules are more important than people, destructiveness is actually inevitable. Now, the second withdrawing kind of family is the modern family found in the most advanced parts of the world, most notably in the US and other Western countries. Changes in attitudes about child rearing has led many people to shudder at the use of physical punishment and guilt in raising kids. The newer idea is to raise kids as your equals. A father should be a boy's best buddy. A mother should be a girl's soulmate. But in the process of controlling their emotions, the parents become coolly indifferent. They are, in fact, no longer real parents, but cohabitants with their kids. The child, now without any real adult guidance, turn into their peers and into social media for their values. This is the modern shallow television family. So, the escape from freedom is particularly obvious here. It is automaton conformity. Although it's still very much a minority family in the world, except of course on television, this is the one Fromm worries about the most. It seems to portend the future. Now, you may ask at this point, what makes a good, healthy, productive family? Fromm suggests it's a family where parents take the responsibility to teach their children reason in an atmosphere of love. Growing up in this sort of family, children learn to acknowledge their freedom and to take responsibilities for themselves and ultimately for society as a whole. So, if you think about it, families mostly just reflect our society and culture, right? Fromm emphasized that we soak up our society with our mother's milk. It is so close to us that we usually forget that our society is just one of an infinite number of ways of dealing with the issue of life. We often think that our ways of doing things is the only way, the natural way. For example, while longanisa is a common Filipino food, different ethnic groups in the Philippines have their own way of making longanisa. In fact, longanisa prepared in vegan tastes very different from the longanisa made by the Ibanag in Tuguegarao. While both longanisas are good for my indiscriminate taste, I bet that if you ask people from vegan what longanisa is the best, they would probably elect their local variant. Actually, same goes with people from, let's say, Tuguegarao or even Lukban or even Cebu. We have learned so well that it has all become unconscious, the social unconscious, to be precise. So many times, we believe that we are acting according to our free will, but we are only following orders we are so used to, we no longer notice them. Fromm believes that our social unconscious is best understood by examining our economic system. In fact, he defines and even names 5 personality types, which we will be talking about later, and which he called orientations in economic terms. If you like, you can take a personality test made up of a list of adjectives Fromm used to describe his orientation. You can find the link to the personality test in the description section of this video. Now, in Fromm's theory, personality is reflected in one's character orientation. That is, a person's relatively permanent way of relating to people and things. Now, Fromm defined personality as the totality of inherited and acquired psychic qualities, which are characteristic of an individual and which makes the individual unique. The most important of the acquired qualities of personality is what he referred to as character, defined as the relatively permanent system of non-instinctual striving through which man or woman or people relates themselves to human and natural world. People relate to the world in two ways, by acquiring and using things, and by relating to self and others. In general terms, people can relate to things and people either non-productively or productively. Fromm identified 5 character orientations, 4 of which are non-productive, and 1 is a productive character orientation. Alright, so people that can acquire things through any of 4 non-productive orientations. Receiving things passively, exploiting others, hoarding objects, and marketing or exchanging things. Fromm used the term non-productive to suggest strategies that fail to move people closer to positive freedom and self-realization. Non-productive orientations are, however, not entirely negative. Each has a both negative and a positive aspect. Personality is always a blend or combination of several orientations, even though one orientation is dominant. So the first of which is the receptive orientation. These people, as the person here suggests, expect to get what they need. If they don't get it immediately, they will wait for it. They believe that all goods and satisfactions come from outside themselves. This type is most common among peasant population. It's also found in cultures that have particularly abundant natural resources. So if you think about it, probably one tamad has this type of orientation. So that one needs not to work hard for one's sustenance. It's also found at the very bottom of any societies, those of slaves, serfs, welfare families, all are at the mercy of other people. So this orientation is associated with symbiotic family, especially where children are swallowed by parents, and with the masochistic or passive form of authoritarianism. It is similar to Freud's oral passive and Adler's learning getting, and probably Horney's compliant personality. Now, in its extreme form, it can be characterized by adjectives such as submissiveness and wishfulness. In a more moderate form, adjectives such as accepting and optimistic are more adaptive, or rather are more descriptive. So, the second is the exploitative orientation. These people expect to have to take what they need. In fact, things increase in their value to the extent that they are taken from others. Wealth is preferably stolen. Think of Ferdinand Marcos here. Ideas plagiarized. Think of Tito Soto here. Love achieved by coercion. Now, this type is prevalent among aristocracies and in the upper classes of colonial empires. Think of the Spaniards who came into the Philippines, for example. Their possession was based entirely on their power to take from the indigenous population in the Philippines. Among their characteristic qualities is the ability to be comfortable ordering other people around. We can also see this type of orientation in pastoral barbarians and other populations who rely on raiding, such as the Vikings. So the exploitative orientation is associated with the swallowing side of the symbiotic family, uh, and with the sadistic side or sadistic style of authoritarianism. They are Freud's oral aggressive, Adler's ruling dominant, and Horney's aggressive types. In extremes, they are aggressive, conceited, and seducing. Mixed with healthier qualities, they are assertive, proud, and even captivating. So the third is the hoarding orientation. And hoarding people expect to keep. They see the world as possessions and potential possessions. Even loved ones are the things to possess, to keep, or to buy. From drawing on Karl Marx, relate this type of orientation to the bourgeoisie, the merchant middle class, as well as richer peasants and craftspeople. He associates it particularly with the Protestant work ethic, and hoarding is associated with the cold form of withdrawal or withdrawing family and with destructiveness. I might add that there is a clear connection with perfectionism as well. And Freud would call it the anal retentive type, Adler to some extent the avoiding type, and Horney a little more clearly the withdrawing type. Now, in its pure form, it means you are stubborn, stingy, and unimaginable. If you are a milder version of this, you might be steadfast, economic, or even practical. Now, the fourth is the marketing orientation. The marketing orientation expects to sell. Success is a matter of how well I can sell myself, package myself, advertise myself, my family, my schooling, my job, my clothes. All are an advertisement and must be of the right kind. Even love is thought of as of a transaction. Only the marketing orientation thinks up the marriage contract wherein we agree that I shall provide such and such, and you will provide this and that. If one of us fail to hold up to our end of the arrangement, the marriage is null and void. No hard feelings. Perhaps we can still be best of friends. Now, according to Fromm, this is the orientation the modern industrial society is in. This is our orientation. This modern type comes out of the cool withdrawing family and tend to use automaton conformity as its escape from freedom. Adler and Horney don't have any equivalent to this, but Freud might. This is at least half of the vague phallic personality. The type that lives in as flirtation or lives life as flirtation. In extreme, the marketing person is opportunistic, childish, tactless. Less extreme, and he or she is purposeful, youthful, social. Notice today's values as expressed by social media. Think of fashion, fitness, eternal youth, material wealth, flexing, adventure, daring, novelty, sexuality. These are the concerns of the influencers. And sadly, of his or her less wealthy admirers too. Now, there is, of course, the productive orientation. There is a healthy personality as well, which Fromm occasionally refers to as the person without a mask. This is the person who, without disavowing his or her biological and social nature, nevertheless does not shirk away from freedom and responsibility. This person comes out of a family that loves without overwhelming the individual, that prefers reason to rules and freedom to conformity. The society that gives rise to the productive type on more than a chance basis does not exist yet, according to Fromm. He does, of course, have some ideas about what it will be like. He calls it humanistic, communitarian socialism. That's quite a mouthful and made up of words that are not exactly popular with the current red tagging government, and especially with General Parlade. So he does, of course, or rather, but before I get red tagged here, let me explain. Humanistic means oriented towards human beings and not towards some higher entity. Not at all about a powerful state, nor someone's conception of God. Communitarian means composed of small communities as opposed to big governments or corporations. So socialism means everyone is responsible for the welfare of everyone else. Thus understood, it's hard to argue with Fromm's idealism. Fromm says that the first four orientations, which others actually might call neurotic, are living in the having mode. They focus on consuming, obtaining, possessing. They are defined by what they have. Fromm says that I have it tends to become it has me, and we become driven by our possessions. The productive orientation, on the other hand, lives in the being mode. What you are is defined by your actions in this world. You live without a mask, experiencing life, relating to other people, and being yourself. So, in here, we can see how all this can tie together. So, as we can see in this table, you have orientation, family, society, escape from freedom, and they are connected with one another. For example, the receptive orientation comes from the symbiotic passive family, which is prevalent in peasant societies who prefer to escape from freedom by the means of authoritarian or masochism. On the other hand, you can see in the third line the hoarding orientation, which comes from the withdrawing puritanical family, which is prevalent in bourgeoisie societies. And they tend to prefer perfectionism to destructiveness as escape from freedom. Lastly, you can see the productive orientation, which springs from a loving and reasoning family that is common in humanistic, communitarian, socialist societies, and who don't escape freedom but rather accept and take full responsibility of it. So, Fromm held that psychologically disturbed people are incapable of love and have failed to establish union with others. These unhealthy people have non-productive ways of working, reasoning, and especially loving. Fromm recognized three major personality disorders: necrophilia, malignant narcissism, and incestuous symbiosis. So we are to talk about all these three. So first is necrophilia. Fromm has always been interested in trying to understand the reality or the really evil people of this world. Not just ones who were confused or misled or sick, but the ones who, with full consciousness of the evil of their acts, perform them anyway. Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Ferdinand Marcos, and so on, large and small. All the orientations we've talked about, productive or even non-productive, in the having mode or in the being mode, have one thing in common. They are all efforts at life. Like Horneye, Fromm believed that even the most miserable neurotic is at least trying to cope with their life. They are, to use his words, biophilus, or life-loving. But there is another type of person he calls necrophilus, the lovers of death. They have the passionate attraction to all that is dead, decaying, putrid, sick. It's the passion to transform that which is alive into something unalive, to destroy for the sake of destruction, the exclusive interest in all that is purely mechanical. It's the passion to tear apart living structures. If you think back to high school, you might remember a few of these people. They were into horror movies. They may have made models of torture devices and guillotines. They love to play war games. They like to blow things up and set things on fire. They got a kick into out of torturing small animals and even killing them. They treasured their weapons. They were really into mechanical devices. The more sophisticated the technology, the happier they were. The 90s icons, Beavis and Buttheads, are modeled after these kids. So, Fromm makes a few guesses as to how such a person happens. He suggested that there may be some genetic flaws that prevent them from feeling or responding to affection. It may also be a matter of a life so full of frustration that the person spends the rest of their life in a rage. And finally, he suggested that it may be a matter of growing up with a necrophilous mother too, so that the child has no one to learn love from. It's very possible that some combinations of these factors is at work. And yet, there is still the idea that these people know what they are doing, are conscious of their evil, and yet chose it anyway. So, just as people may display some necrophilic behaviors, so too do all have some narcissistic tendencies. Now, healthy people manifest a benign form of narcissism, that is, an interest in their own bodies. In its malign form, narcissism impedes the perception of reality so that everything belonging to a narcissistic person is highly valued and everything belonging to another is devalued. Now, narcissistic individuals are preoccupied with themselves, but this concern is not limited to admitting themselves or admiring themselves in the mirror. Preoccupation with one's body often leads to hypochondriasis or an obsessive attention to one's health. Fromm also discussed moral hypochondriasis or a preoccupation with guilt about previous transgressions. People who are fixated on themselves are likely to internalize experiences and to dwell on both physical health and moral virtues. Now, a third pathological orientation is incestual symbiosis, or an extreme dependence on the mother or mothering surrogate. Incestual symbiosis is an exaggerated form of the more common and more benign mother fixation. Men with a mother fixation need a woman to care for them, dote on them rather, and admire them. They feel somewhat anxious and depressed when their needs are not fulfilled. This condition is relatively normal and does not greatly interfere with their daily life. With incestuous symbiosis, however, people are inseparable from their host person. Their personalities are blended with the other person and their individual identities are lost. Incestuous symbiosis originates in infancy as a natural attachment to the mothering one. This attachment is more crucial and fundamental than any sexual interest that may develop during the Oedipal stage. So, some pathological individuals possess all three personality disorders. That is, they are attracted to death, take pleasure in destroying those whom they regard as inferior, and possess a neurotic symbiotic relationship with their mother or mother substitutes. So such people form what Fromm called the syndrome of decay. He contrasted these pathological people with those who are marked by the syndrome of growth, which is made up of the opposite qualities, namely biophilia, love, and positive freedom. Now, like many others, Erich Fromm believed that we have needs that go far beyond the basic physiological ones that some people like Freud and many behaviorists think explain all our behaviors. He calls this human needs in contrast to the more basic animal needs. And he suggests that the human needs can be expressed in one simple statement. The human being needs to find an answer to his existence. Fromm says that helping us to answer this question is perhaps the major purpose of culture. In a way, he says all cultures are like religions. trying to explain the meaning of life. Some, of course, do better than others. A more negative way of expressing these needs is to say that we need to avoid insanity. And he defines neurosis as an effort to satisfy the need for answers that does not work for us. He says that every neurosis is a sort of private religion, one we turn to when our cultures no longer satisfies us. And now he lists 5 human needs, the first of which is the need for relatedness. As human beings, we are aware of our separateness from each other and seek to overcome it. Fromm calls this as our need for relatedness and views it as love in the broadest sense. Love, he says, take note of this, is a union with somebody or something outside oneself under the condition of relate or retaining the separateness and integrity of one's own self. This means that loving is not owning. Loving is not changing the person. Loving is having the respect not to make the person fit into your life, but rather to find a place for wherein you can find a common ground between you and the person. So it allows us to transcend our separateness without denying us of our uniqueness. Now, the need is so powerful that sometimes we seek it in unhealthy ways. For example, some seek to eliminate their isolation by submitting themselves to another person, a group, or to their conception of God. Others look to eliminate their isolation by dominating others. Either way, they're not satisfying. Your separateness is not overcome. Another way some people attempt to overcome this need is by denying it. The opposite of relatedness is what Fromm called as narcissism. Narcissism, or the love of self, is natural in infants in that they don't perceive themselves as separate from the world and other to begin with. But in adults, it's a source of pathology. Like the schizophrenic, the narcissist has only one reality, the world of his own thoughts, feelings, and his needs. He would become what he wants to be, and he would lose contact with reality. So the second human need is creativity. Fromm believed that we all desire to overcome, to transcend another fact of our being, our sense of being passive creatures. We want to be creators. There are many ways to be creative. We give birth, we plant seeds, we make pots, we make videos like this, we paint pictures, we write books, we love each other. So creativity is, according to Fromm, in fact, an expression of love. Unfortunately, some don't find an avenue for creativity. Frustrated, they attempt to transcend their passivity by becoming destroyers instead. Destroying puts me above the things or people I destroy. It makes me feel powerful. We can hate as well as love, but in the end, it fails to bring us the sense of transcendence we need. The third need is the need for rootedness. And we also need roots. We need to feel at home in the universe. Even though as human beings, we are somewhat alienated from the natural world. So the simplest version is to maintain our ties with our mothers. But to grow up means we have to leave the warmth of our mother's love. To stay would be what Fromm calls as kind of psychological incest. In order to manage in the difficult world of adulthood, we need to find new broader roots. We need to discover our brotherhood and sisterhood with humanity. This too has its pathological side. For example, the schizophrenic tries to retreat to a womb-like existence, one where you might say the umbilical cord has never been cut. There is also the neurotic who is afraid to leave his home, even just to go out and buy food for themselves. And there's the fanatic who sees his tribe, his country, his president, his church as the only good one, the only real one. Everyone else is a dangerous outsider to be avoided or even be destroyed. The fourth need is the need for a sense of identity. Man according to Fromm, may be defined as the animal that can say I. Fromm believes that we need to have a sense of identity or of individuality in order to stay sane. This need is so powerful that we are sometimes driven to find it, for example, by doing anything for signs of status or by trying desperately to conform. We sometimes will even give up our lives in order to remain a part of a group, but this is only pretend identity, an identity we take from others instead of one we develop of ourselves, and it fails to satisfy our needs. Lastly, we have a need for a frame of orientation. So, we need to understand the world and our place in it. Again, our society and especially the religious aspect of our culture often attempts to provide us with this understanding. Things like our myths, our philosophies, and our sciences provide us with structure. Fromm says that this reality or this really are actually two needs. First, we need a frame of orientation. Almost anything will do. Even bad one is better than none. And so people are generally quite gullible. We want to believe, sometimes even desperately so. If we don't have an explanation handy, we will make one via rationalization. The second aspect is that we want to have a good frame of orientation, one that is useful and accurate. This is where reason comes in. It's nice that our parents and other people provide us with explanations for the world and our lives, but if they don't hold up, what good are they? A frame of orientation needs also to be rational. Fromm adds one more thing. He says we don't just want a cold philosophy or material science. We want a frame of orientation that provides us with meaning. We want understanding, but we want a warm human understanding. So, in conclusion, Fromm is some ways a transition figure, or if you prefer, a theorist that bring other theories together. Most significantly for us, he draws together the Freudian and Neo-Freudian theories that we have talked about, Adler and Horney, and the humanistic theories that we will be talking about later. He is in fact so close to being an existentialist that it almost doesn't matter. I believe interest in his ideas will rise as the fortune for existential psychology does. Another aspect of his theory is fairly unique to him is his interest in economics and cultural roots of personality. No one before or since has put it so directly. Your personality is to a considerable extent a reflection of such issues as social class, minority status, education, vocation, religious and philosophical background, and so forth. So this has been very underrepresented, a very underrepresented view, perhaps because of its association with Marxism, but it is, I think, inevitable that we begin to consider it more and more, especially as a counterbalance to the increasing influence of biological theories. Lastly, let's talk about Fromm's concept of humanity. So, Fromm believed that humans were freaks of the universe because they lack strong animal instincts while possessing the ability to reason. In brief, his view is rated average on free choice, optimism, unconscious influences, and uniqueness. On one hand, he believed that most people do not accomplish a reunion with nature and or other people, and that few people achieve positive freedom. He also had a rather negative attitude towards modern capitalism, which he insisted was responsible for most people's feelings of isolation and aloneness while clinging desperately to the illusion of independence and freedom. Fromm slightly favored teleology and social influences over causality and biological influences of personality. He believed that people constantly strive for a frame of orientation, a roadmap by which to plan their lives into the future. So Fromm placed somewhat more importance to the impact of history, culture, and society than on biology. So that ends our lesson on Erich Fromm's humanistic psychoanalysis. My name is Dex Kamitan, and thank you for watching.